It was one of those days where time seemed to play against us. I had spent the morning rushing through last-minute preparations for my sister's birthday party, a celebration I was supposed to attend with my son, Benjamin. At 19, he had grown into a confident, self-assured young man, and I was proud of him in every way. At 39, I felt a mix of pride and anxiety about how quickly our lives seemed to be changing. We were running late when we stepped into the elevator, a cozy yet unremarkable box, its dim light casting shadows on the metallic walls. The air inside was slightly stale, but we barely noticed as we pressed the button for the ground floor, both preoccupied with a list of things still left to do. The elevator jolted into motion, and I glanced at Benjamin, his tall frame slightly hunched as he scrolled through his phone. Then, without warning, the elevator shuddered to a stop. "What just happened?" Benjamin asked, his tone a mix of surprise and irritation. He tapped the button for the ground floor again, but nothing happened. The small screen on the panel blinked, then went dark. I reached for the emergency call button, pressing it firmly, but no response came. "It's not working," I murmured, a hint of unease creeping into my voice. Benjamin stepped closer to the panel, trying the button himself before shaking his head. "Great. Just great." We exchanged a glance, the tension between us palpable. The confined space suddenly felt smaller, and the faint hum of the elevator's mechanism had been replaced by an unnerving silence. "Well," I said, trying to keep the mood light, "I guess we'll have to wait for someone to notice we're stuck." Benjamin leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "Good thing we're not in a hurry or anything." I laughed softly, though it felt forced. "At least we're together." He smirked, his usual playfulness shining through despite the situation. "Yeah, because being stuck in an elevator with your mom is every teenager's dream." I rolled my eyes, settling onto the floor. "Come on, sit down. No point in standing." He hesitated before sitting across from me, stretching out his legs. The elevator was small, but there was just enough room for us to sit without being cramped. For a while we sat in silence, the tension between us fading as the minutes ticked by. I studied him, noticing how much he had grown. His broad shoulders, the sharp line of his jaw. He wasn't the little boy who used to cling to my hand anymore. "You've changed a lot," I said softly, breaking the silence. He looked at me, his brows furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" I smiled, shaking my head. "I don't know. You just seem older. More mature. It's like I blinked and you grew up." Benjamin leaned back, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Well, you've changed too, you know." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? How?" He shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "You're not as uptight as you used to be." I gasped, feigning offense. "Uptight? I'll have you know I'm the cool mom." He chuckled, the sound filling the small space. "Yeah, sure. Keep telling yourself that." We both laughed, the tension between us dissolving entirely. For the first time in what felt like ages, I realized how much I missed moments like this. Simple, honest conversations with my son. Time passed, though we had no way of knowing how long we'd been stuck. Benjamin checked his phone periodically, but the lack of signal made it useless. I tried pressing the emergency button again, but still no response. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the air in the elevator grew warmer, and I could feel a light sheen of sweat forming on my brow. Benjamin noticed and handed me a bottle of water from his bag. "Thanks," I said, taking a sip. He nodded, watching me with a look I couldn't quite place, something between concern and curiosity. "You okay?" He nodded. "Just tired. And a little claustrophobic, I guess." He shifted closer, his tone soft. "We'll be out of here soon, Mom. Don't worry." His reassurance was comforting, though I couldn't help but notice the shift in his demeanor. There was a quiet strength in the way he spoke, a protectiveness that reminded me of how much he had grown. As we waited, the conversation continued to flow, touching on everything from his college plans to memories of family vacations. We laughed, reminisced, and shared stories we hadn't thought about in years. Despite the situation, I felt an unexpected warmth, a closeness that had been missing in our relationship lately. And as the hours passed, I couldn't help but wonder if this unexpected pause in our lives was exactly what we needed. The air in the elevator had grown colder, seeping through the cracks of the metallic box. I rubbed my arms instinctively, wishing I'd worn a thicker coat. It wasn't just the chill. The power outage had clearly affected the building's heating system, leaving the elevator to descend into an uncomfortable, biting cold. Benjamin noticed almost immediately. He scooted closer to me, his movements purposeful yet unassuming. His arm slipped around my shoulders in a gesture that felt both protective and natural. I stiffened at first, startled by the warmth radiating from him, but then I relaxed, letting my head rest lightly against his shoulder. "You're freezing," he said softly, his voice tinged with concern. "I'm fine," I replied automatically, though my teeth were close to chattering. He pulled me closer, his arm tightening around me. "No, you're not. You've got goosebumps." I let out a small laugh. "Well, you'd think a stuck elevator would be warmer than this." He chuckled, the sound low and soothing. "Guess we're unlucky today." His scent drifted toward me, a blend of sandalwood and something crisp, maybe bergamot. It was subtle yet unmistakable, and I couldn't help but inhale deeply, letting it settle in my chest. His cologne had always been pleasant, but here, in the quiet intimacy of the elevator, it felt oddly grounding. For a moment I closed my eyes, focusing on the rise and fall of his breath beside me. It calmed the unease that had been simmering since we got stuck, but beneath that calm, something unexpected flickered. A warmth that had nothing to do with his proximity or the cold air around us began to stir in my chest. "You smell nice," I said softly, the words escaping before I could think better of them. He glanced down at me, a hint of a smirk playing on his lips. "Yeah, well thanks." I wasn't sure anyone could smell it over the cheap elevator air. I laughed again, shaking my head. "No, it's nice. Comforting, actually." Benjamin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted slightly, his other arm resting on his knee as he leaned closer, his expression thoughtful. Then, with a boyish grin, he said, "You know, the guests at Aunt Lauren's party are pretty unlucky tonight." I raised an eyebrow, caught off guard. "Why's that?" He tilted his head toward me, his voice dropping into a tone that was unexpectedly earnest. "Because they won't get to see you. You're the most beautiful woman there." My breath caught. The words were simple yet disarming, their sincerity wrapping around me like a warm blanket. I felt my cheeks flush, and I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the way his gaze lingered on me. "Benjamin," I said, attempting to laugh off the compliment, though my voice trembled slightly, "you're just saying that to make me feel better." He shook his head, his expression unwavering. "I'm not. I mean it." I looked away, my heart thudding in my chest. It wasn't the first time someone had complimented me, but coming from him, it felt different. More intimate, more meaningful. "You always do that," he said after a pause, his tone softer now. "Do what?" I asked, glancing back at him. "Brush off compliments. Like you don't believe them." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't wrong. It had been years since I'd felt truly confident in myself, and his words, though kind, felt almost too generous to accept. "You're too sweet," I said finally, my voice quieter now. "It's not about being sweet," he replied, his gaze steady. "I'm just telling the truth. You're beautiful, Mom. You've always been." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I swallowed hard, my emotions swirling in a way I couldn't quite pinpoint. His arm around me was warm, his presence grounding, but beneath it all, there was something else, something that felt fragile and electric all at once. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made my chest tighten. "You don't have to thank me. Just believe it." We sat in silence for a while, his arm still around me, the chill in the elevator fading into the background. I found myself leaning into him more, drawn by his warmth and the comfort of his steady presence. The space between us felt smaller, the lines of our relationship shifting in subtle, unspoken ways. The elevator walls seemed to blur, the metallic sheen fading into the periphery as I focused on the steady beat of his heart against my shoulder. My fingers toyed absently with the fabric of my coat, my mind swirling with thoughts I couldn't quite organize. "Do you think they've noticed we're gone yet?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. "Probably," he replied, his tone playful. "But honestly, I'm not in a rush to get out of here." "Why not?" I asked, glancing up at him. He shrugged, his smile returning. "'Cause it's nice. Just being here with you. No distractions, no one else around. Feels good." I nodded, my throat tightening as I tried to push away the flicker of something deeper that his words stirred. "Yeah, it does." In that quiet, confined space, it felt as though time had stopped. The cold no longer bit at my skin, and the tension that had once filled the elevator had melted away, replaced by a warmth that was both comforting and confusing. And as we sat there, our shoulders brushing, the hum of the outside world felt a million miles away. His arm remained wrapped around my shoulders, grounding me, but my thoughts felt anything but steady. He shifted slightly, his gaze fixed on the metallic panel in front of us. His fingers idly tapped his knee, a gesture I'd noticed he did whenever he was thinking about something deeply. "What's on your mind?" I asked, breaking the silence that had settled between us. He glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. "Just life, I guess." I raised an eyebrow. "That's vague." He smiled faintly, a soft laugh escaping his lips. "'Kay, fine. I've been thinking a lot about the kind of person I want to spend my life with. Like, the kind of person I'd want to marry one day." That wasn't what I'd expected. "Oh, yeah." He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I've realized something." I waited, the curiosity in his voice pulling at me. "I want someone like you," he said finally. His words quiet yet firm. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The statement hung in the air, wrapping around me with a weight I hadn't anticipated. "Benjamin," I began, my voice faltering slightly. That's a really sweet thing to say." He turned to face me, his expression earnest. "Mean it, Mom. You're strong, kind, funny. You're everything I'd want in a partner." The sincerity in his voice left me speechless. My heart skipped a beat, a warmth spreading through my chest that I couldn't quite name. "Benjamin," I said softly, trying to find the right words. "That's such a beautiful thing to hear. But I'm your mother." "And you're also amazing," he interrupted gently. "I know it sounds weird, but can't help it. You've set the bar so high for what I want in someone. It's not just that you're my mom. It's who you are." His words struck a chord deep within me. I felt a mix of emotions, flattered, confused, and, to my surprise, touched. He wasn't saying this to charm me or out of some fleeting impulse. It was clear that he had thought about it, that it came from a place of genuine admiration. "Benjamin," I said after a long pause, "that's one of the nicest things anyone has ever said to me." He smiled softly. "I'm just being honest." I looked away, the emotions swirling within me almost too much to process. The weight of his gaze was undeniable, his presence filling the small space between us. And then, before I could say anything else, he leaned in. It happened so quickly, yet time seemed to slow. His lips brushed against mine, tentative and soft, as though he was testing the boundaries of this moment. My breath caught, my heart pounding in my chest as I froze. For a brief moment, I felt the world tilt on its axis. His touch was gentle, filled with a tenderness that left me speechless. My thoughts raced, a jumble of confusion, warmth, and disbelief. "Benjamin," I whispered as we broke apart, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his expression a mix of vulnerability and determination. I couldn't keep it in anymore. I felt this way for a long time, and being here with you like this, it just felt right." I stared at him, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The lines of our relationship had blurred in ways I hadn't expected, leaving me unsure of how to proceed. You don't have to say anything, he added, his voice quieter now. I needed you to know how I feel. His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he searched my face for a reaction. And as I sat there, the cold air of the elevator seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the warmth of this moment, unexpected, intense, and undeniably real. For a long time, neither of us spoke, the silence between us carrying more weight than any words could. I felt as though I was standing on the edge of something profound, something I couldn't fully understand. And yet, despite the confusion, I couldn't deny the sincerity in his gaze or the depth of the emotions he had just shared. Benjamin, I said finally, my voice soft but steady. This is a lot to take in. He nodded, his expression earnest. No. And I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable. That's the last thing I'd ever want. I reached out, placing a hand on his. You haven't. It's just unexpected. He smiled faintly. Get that. As the elevator remained still, the quiet enveloping us once again, I felt the weight of the moment settle over us. It was uncharted territory, a place where emotions and reality intertwined in ways I hadn't anticipated. But in the depth of his gaze, I saw something undeniable, a connection that went beyond words, beyond labels. And though I didn't know what the future held, I knew this moment would stay with me forever. I couldn't stop replaying the moment, his words, and the depth of his gaze. For the first time I began to see the pieces I had missed before, the small, seemingly inconsequential things that now felt significant. His compliments, the way his eyes lingered on me during conversations, the subtle shift in his demeanor when we were alone, they all came rushing back, rearranging themselves into a picture I had been blind to before. Had this been building for a long time? I felt foolish for not recognizing it sooner, yet also unsure of what I would have done had I noticed. It was disarming, thrilling, and unsettling all at once. Benjamin had always been affectionate, but now I could see how it had deepened, becoming something far more complex. I remembered the way he would casually brush my hair from my face, his hand lingering just a moment too long, or how his words of admiration had felt so sincere. Yet I dismissed them as a son's love for his mother. But this was different. This was raw, unfiltered, and it left me reeling. The silence between us wasn't awkward, but heavy with unspoken emotions. Benjamin sat close to me, his posture relaxed, though I could tell he was waiting for my reaction, bracing himself for whatever might come next. Before either of us could say anything, the elevator shuddered, the dim lights flickering back to life. A voice crackled through the intercom, informing us that the doors would open shortly. We're free, Benjamin said, his voice soft. I nodded, but my heart was racing. The reality of being released felt bittersweet. As much as I wanted to leave the confines of the elevator, I also knew that once we stepped out, the world would come rushing back. The clarity and intimacy of this moment would blur against the backdrop of reality. When the elevator doors finally slid open, the cold air from the hallway swept in, reminding me how long we'd been trapped. Benjamin stepped out first, turning to offer me his hand. I hesitated, still shaken by everything that had unfolded in that small, confined space. Yet his steady gaze calmed me, and I placed my hand in his. The building was silent, the buzz of fluorescent lights casting long shadows down the corridor. It was late. Much later than I'd realized, and the thought of continuing on to my sister's birthday party felt absurd now. We should just go home, Benjamin said, almost as if reading my thoughts. His voice was calm but firm, laced with a gentleness that made my chest tighten. He nodded. Yeah, I don't think we'd make it in time anyway. He smiled faintly, his grip on my hand tightening as he led me toward the exit. My mind felt like a whirlwind, the events of the evening swirling in a confusing, emotional storm. The kiss, his confession, the quiet intimacy we'd shared. It was as if we'd stepped into an entirely different world while stuck in that elevator. Now, out in the open, the weight of reality pressed on me. Yet Benjamin's presence beside me grounded me. his steady hand a constant reminder of the connection we'd forged in those unexpected hours. The walk back to the apartment was quiet. The streets were nearly deserted, the faint hum of traffic in the distance the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. Streetlights cast a golden glow over the sidewalks, and the cool air nipped at my skin. Benjamin noticed and shrugged off his jacket, draping it over my shoulders before I could protest. "Thanks," I murmured, pulling it tighter around me. He smiled, his hand brushing against mine as we walked. It felt natural when our fingers intertwined, his warmth seeping into my cold skin. By the time we reached the apartment, I was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. The weight of everything that had happened was catching up to me, and all I wanted was the comfort of home. Benjamin unlocked the door and stepped aside to let me in, his presence steady and reassuring. The apartment was quiet, the familiar space somehow feeling different now. I slipped off my shoes and draped his jacket over the back of a chair, the scent of his cologne lingering faintly in the fabric. "I'll make some tea," he said, his voice breaking the silence. I nodded, watching as he moved to the kitchen. The simplicity of the gesture brought a sense of calm to the storm brewing inside me. I sank onto the couch, letting out a long breath. My thoughts raced as I replayed the moments in the elevator. The kiss, his words, the way he looked at me with such sincerity. My heart was torn between the undeniable warmth his presence brought me and the unsettling realization that our relationship had shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. When Benjamin returned with 2 mugs of tea, he set them down on the coffee table and sat beside me. The couch dipped slightly under his weight, and I felt the heat of him radiating beside me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure if it was true. "It's just a lot to process," I admitted. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle yet grounding. "I know," he said. "I don't want to overwhelm you, but I also don't want to hide how I feel." His honesty disarmed me. I looked at him, searching his face for some hint of uncertainty or hesitation, but there was none. His expression was open, his gaze steady and filled with an earnestness that made my chest ache. "Benjamin," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "this is complicated. You're my son. And yet it feels right," he finished for me, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. I couldn't deny the truth in his words. As unsettling as it was to admit, there was a part of me that felt the same. Being with him, even in this strange new way, felt natural, like something that had been quietly building between us for longer than I'd realized. "I don't want you to feel pressured," he continued, his voice steady. I need you to know how much you mean to me. And whatever happens, I'll always be here for you." Tears welled in my eyes at the raw emotion in his words. I squeezed his hand, the weight of the moment settling over us. "You mean a lot to me too, Benjamin," I said softly. "You always have. But it's not something we can rush into." He nodded, his expression understanding. "I'm not asking you to rush," he said. "I just want to be with you. However that looks, whatever that means, I'm okay with it." The tenderness in his voice unraveled me. I leaned into him, resting my head against his shoulder. His arm came around me, holding me close, and for the first time that night, I felt a sense of peace. We stayed like that for a long time, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around us like a cocoon. The tea sat forgotten on the coffee table, the steam curling into the air. As I closed my eyes, I couldn't help but feel the duality of the emotions coursing through me. Love and doubt, comfort and fear. But in the steady beat of Benjamin's heart against my ear, I found a small sense of clarity. Whatever lay ahead, I knew we'd face it together. And as unsettling as the thought was, it also brought a warmth that I hadn't felt in years.